Our speaker today is a department chair and an associate professor of modern languages. He earned his PhD in Spanish from the University of Kansas and played an instrumental role in the development of the Wabash Study in Ecuador program. With a chapel talk entitled Our Obligations to the Past, please welcome Dr. Dan Rogers.
You know, Will's introductions are the model of what a chapel talk ought to be, short and sweet, right? Right to the point. I'm honored to be asked to give a chapel talk today and appreciate very much not only the opportunity, but your willingness to brave the cold. It was great to watch you all file in, administrators and staff and faculty and students, Rhineys, and freshmen. Well, it's February, so maybe a few less freshmen. Well, I want to note the Fijis there, proudly in attendance. I know you've heard people say it many times, but it's true, and so bears repeating. Chapel is a great Wabash tradition, and your willingness to be here, even on a cold February morning, is an important part of what it means to be a citizen of this college. I say this to remind us all that we have an obligation to things like chapel, because we have an obligation to our past. But more on that in a second. I first need to tell you that when I found out just 48 hours ago, and that's Tuesday for those of you who didn't place into Math 112, that I would have the honor of giving a chapel talk this week, the warm glow of the honor of being asked was quickly replaced with the cold sweat of realizing that I had less time than usual to come up with a topic and prepare my speech. Like a freshman in Rhetoric 101 who has put off his homework, I realized that in a very short space of time I would be standing before you, and I needed something to say. Unlike a freshman in Rhetoric 101, I was unwilling to pull an all-nighter to do so. So thank goodness for colleagues who are as generous with advice as they are with constructive criticism. You see, the same day I was asked to speak at chapel, a young Sphinx Club Rhiney, who will remain nameless, showed up for his ESH job in my department, dressed as a frayed, scruffy, threadbare Cupid, like something dragged out of Jerry Springer's worst nightmare. This young Rhine, whose last name, oddly enough, rhymes with Esh, reminded me that my favorite times of the year are Valentine's Day and Halloween. Rhineys dressed up in amusing costumes dispensing candy. What could be better? So I began to write a chapel talk, attempting to trace the history of this custom and describe its significance in greater philosophical and anthropological terms. A kind of ode to air raids, if you will. Just at that moment, in the throes of writing, a colleague stepped into my office and asked me what I was up to. I explained the pressure of my short deadline and began to outline my idea for a disquisition, a philosophical, almost theological exploration of the greater significance of young men rolling around on the mall trying to shoot down imaginary airplanes. Fortunately for me and for you, this colleague saw, as quickly as you all must have, what a bad idea this would have been. And in the process, reminded me of how important good colleagues are, people who are willing to tell you when you have good ideas, that's easy, and more importantly, people who will help set you straight when you begin to go off the rails. Now, I was also reminded of the importance of good colleagues last night at Senior Colloquium. Now, for those of you who don't know, Senior Colloquium is one of the crown jewels of the Wabash curriculum. 2 professors and about 15 or so seniors gather in a room on the third floor of Center Hall, and they discuss important books and ideas. It's the very essence of liberal arts education. In the 12 years, and I mean this, in the 12 years that I've been teaching the course, I have never left a Senior Colloquium disappointed, and last night was no exception. One thing that made last night particularly memorable was having the opportunity to teach it with Bill Cook. We discussed Soren Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. The evening flew by, as it always does. And as we sat at the end and began to discuss the grades that we would give the students, Dr. Cook reminded me that he had taken colloquium, senior colloquium, in 1966 and had sat with Eric Dean as the professor and discussed Fear and Trembling by Soren Kierkegaard. Now, what's interesting about that is that in 1966, Professor Cook was a respected senior, well-spoken, I'm sure, on his way to graduate school at Cornell and at the beginning of what would be an illustrious career as an historian. In 1966, I was 3 months old and not capable of much of anything at all. So colloquium, like chapel, is one of those moments when those of us who are newer to the college get the opportunity to connect to its past. When Dr. Cook was a student, and Eric Dean was here, he taught with other gentlemen, Jack Charles, Vic Powell among them, who are giants in Wabash lore today. Unfortunately, for you who are students, and for me as a professor, only in my second decade at the college, Eric Dean died in 1989 before we could meet him. Teaching with Bill last night and hearing his stories about Professor Dean helps keep this memory alive and reminds us that we have an obligation to our past. One of the reasons we have an obligation to the past is that we forget it so quickly. The student body completely renews itself every 4 years, and new professors are hired every year. So it takes work to remind the newcomers of our past. With that important responsibility in mind, I want to remind freshmen and sophomores of one of the great legends who sadly they may not have had the opportunity to meet, Bill Plaker. Dr. Plaker passed away on November 30th, 2008, but he was on his sabbatical year, and so the entering class of 2012 never got the chance to meet him. What should you know about Bill Plaker? Plaker was modest. So modest, in fact, that many students who had classes with him didn't realize until after they'd graduated that they'd taken a class with one of the most influential and important theologians of our time. A quick aside on that point. A few years ago, my parents lived in Washington, D.C. Now, those of you who know me know that my parents are deeply committed Mormons. Now, most churches have some kind of national presence in Washington, D.C., and my parents' next-door neighbor was a high-ranking official in the Presbyterian national offices. So there they were, Mormon and Presbyterian, living side by side, always polite to one another, but with a subtle undercurrent of rivalry. One week, my wife and I were visiting my parents, and as we were leaving to go to the Smithsonian, he walked out of his house at the same time that we were getting in the car. So my parents introduced him to us. There was some brief, perfunctory, polite conversation, and then they mentioned to him that their son taught at Wabash College. The man's eyes widened, and he turned and asked if I knew Bill Plaker. I said, yes, of course I know Bill Plaker. Bill was a friend and a colleague. And my mother had no idea who Bill Plaker was, but she filled with pride. I could see her grow inches in front of us because her son knew Bill Plaker. And so her Presbyterian neighbor could just take that. Thank you very much. Bill loved that story, and I love to tell it, now more than ever, because it reminds me of our collective link to the college's past. Now, Bill was one of the greatest orators our college has ever known. His chapel talks were extraordinary. And so to honor Bill and the tradition of chapel and our collective past, I want to close with an extended quotation from a talk that Bill gave from this podium on the 175th anniversary of the founding of Wabash College. I especially like the way that Bill understood the college and its past. Bill knew that you can disagree with the decisions an institution makes and still love it. In fact, I think Bill would have said that you can't really love this place without at least sometimes disagreeing with it. A college, after all, is like its students, always changing, always in process. Our collective memory of the past holds us together as we argue and debate its future. So let me close with this extended quotation. Bill said, and I quote him now, "I found my thoughts turning particularly to what seems to me a crucial time in Wabash history just 100 years ago. That time, a few years before World War I, doesn't loom large in American history generally, but it was a rich time for Wabash. 1907-08 was the time of the greatest hostility and division in the faculty in Wabash history. And of our greatest athletic accomplishments, the founding of our school newspaper, our most famous faculty member, and one of our most remarkable alumni. Faculty divisions first. Perhaps we should reflect on the fact that the nastiness had to do with curriculum revision. Only the faculty are laughing. Be forewarned, in the late 19th century, Wabash students could still choose between the classical course and the scientific course. I want you to understand this. There were two majors, the classical course and the scientific course. In 1883, for instance, freshmen in the classical course took mathematics, Latin, and Greek. In the sophomore year, they took, well, mathematics, Latin, and Greek. In the junior year, physics, chemistry, and a course in the evidences of Christianity replaced mathematics, and German was added to Latin and Greek. In the senior year, there were some electives. Students in the scientific course could do English literature and zoology instead of Greek in the freshman year. Of course, they still had to take Latin. Later, they did French and German, as well as physics and chemistry. By 1901, however, a majority of the faculty voted for a more modern curriculum. There were more electives and less required Latin. Students still had to read Caesar, Cicero, and Virgil, but they could now dispense with Livy and Horace. The new curriculum increased enrollment dramatically and had the support of trustees and alumni, but it encountered stern faculty resistance. In a key vote in January 1905, the then 12 members of the faculty split 6-6. And President Kane, by the way, President Kane is the third one down. If you want to look up President, yep, that's him. President Kane, thanks to Jim Amadon for helping me find him earlier. President Kane had to cast the deciding vote in favor of innovation. The faculty remained bitterly divided, and half scarcely speaking to the other half. And faculty meetings, previously held weekly, were so stressful as to be held as seldom as possible. On one occasion, not at all for 3 months. Well, every cloud has a silver lining. One of my favorite Bill Plaker lines. In the midst of these battles, the Board of Trustees voted that, quote, "It is believed by the board that no member of the faculty is wanting in sincere loyalty to the college or desire for its prosperity." They recognized that people passionately on both sides of important issues could all wish what was best for the college. But it's probably significant that they felt they had to say it. President Kane made other changes too. One of the college traditions had been that of corridor rushing. After chapel, then held in the north end of the second floor of Center Hall, where my colleagues, Bill's colleagues, in philosophy and religion now have their offices, the freshmen would move quickly to the south end of the corridor, and down by Professor Cook's office, the sophomores would assemble at the north end. With the largest members of each class in front, they would rush at each other down the corridor. President Kane's office was in the middle of the building. Now, one day he emerged just as the two forces were meeting, throwing him high into the air, and the practice was thereafter discontinued. The athletes who led those charges in Center Hall had more success in more formal athletic activities. The first decade of the 20th century may still stand as the most remarkable time for Wabash athletics. From 1903 to 1907, the basketball team won 66 of 69 games played, playing against Purdue, Indiana, Notre Dame, Minnesota, and Yale. In 1906, indeed, Wabash played Yale for the National Basketball Championship here in Crawfordsville and defeated them 24-8. Those teams were presumably inspired by hearing the new college cheer, which went, "Hoorah, hoorah, hoorah, smash, hooray for the scarlet of old Wabash, hip, skitty, bow, wow, wahoo, wah, Wabash, Wabash, rah, rah, rah. I guess you had to be there. The juxtaposition of Wabash's athletic victories and small size had already led to references to the big little team and the good little men. But it was Francis Caillou who first referred to Wabash, the Wabash team, as little giants. Caillou was one of the most famed football coaches in our college history, and he must have been an extraordinary man, according to Plaker. Here, only 4 years, while in his early 30s, he left a lasting impression on all players. When the team had fallen behind St. Louis University at halftime in the 1907 season, Caillou gave a halftime speech no one who heard it ever forgot, concluding by saying with tears in his eyes that he would play no one in the second half who was not willing to shake his hand, look him in the eye, and promise not to leave the field without a victory. One by one, they shook his hand and went out to win 12-11. Bill says that he wishes he could leave the story there. But since his topic is Wabash history more broadly defined, he says, I have to go on. After the game, Caillou was seized by some friends and taken to the hotel bar to celebrate, so that he missed the train home. Coach Caillou was a Sioux Indian. And when the football players arrived in Crawfordsville with a great victory but no coach, it was surely neither the first time nor the last that a Wabash faculty member has had a few strong drinks. But Caillou was a Native American, and the stereotype of the drunken Indian was so strong that this one incident was enough to get him fired. He had a few more coaching jobs, all for brief periods, and worked for a while selling Spalding athletic gear, but by 1923, he'd gone back to a Sioux reservation in Oklahoma, where he lived out the last 25 years of his life, trying to live in traditional Indian ways, wearing Sioux garb and speaking to white men as little as possible. The white world had betrayed him, and he wanted nothing more to do with it. It's a story to remind us of the bigotry that infests the history of Wabash and every American institution. So, Bill concludes, thinking about the difficulties, the tensions in our past, and says, dear friends, there is a live tradition in the air around us as well. A tradition of curricular debates, football coaches, poets and alumni who went far away but never quite forgot their old college. We learn from our history that this college can respect even those who disagree with its institutional decisions, that our traditions have a dark side, and that even those who go furthest away can remember this small college with affection. What we love well, our true heritage, is above all the teaching and learning that goes on here. One person to another, very different kinds of people interacting and arguing and coming to care about each other as people at Wabash do in 2007, I would argue in 2010, as they did in 1907, and have ever since our founders knelt in the snow in the midst of the frontier forest 175 years ago, the year that this talk was given. And I can think of no better words to conclude with. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rogers. A couple quick announcements. Good luck to swimming in the NCAC championships as they travel to Canton, Ohio this weekend. Track and field as they travel to IU tomorrow. And Saturday at 1 p.m. in Chadwick Court, our basketball team takes on Oberlin. Let's all rise and sing Old Wabash.